Almost went home. Have you ever packed your bags in your mind before you packed them in real life? I'm asking because this entire video lives inside that moment. The moment when you wake up in a foreign country, stare at the ceiling, and think, maybe I should stop trying. If you've ever wanted to give up on learning English, on a dream, or on yourself, this story is already about you. I almost went home. I really did. And what stopped me wasn't motivation, or confidence, or talent. It was something much quieter. The first week I arrived in the United States, nothing dramatic happened. And that was the problem. No movie-style welcome. No inspiring speech. Just silence, unfamiliar air, and a strange feeling that my life had been muted. The sky looked bigger, but colder. The streets were wide, but empty. People smiled politely, yet their words passed through my ears like fast-moving water. I knew English on paper. Grammar books loved me. But real English? Real English didn't slow down for anyone. You wake up early because your body hasn't learned the time difference yet. Your phone says 6 a.m., but your brain says midnight. You make coffee that tastes wrong because even the water is different. And then the thoughts begin. Maybe you're not brave. Maybe you misunderstood your own abilities. Maybe learning English like this, through life, through people, through mistakes, is too much. Psychologically, this is a known state. When the brain faces too many new stimuli at once, language, culture, climate, social rules, it goes into protection mode. Motivation drops. Memory feels foggy. You don't feel stupid, but you feel slow. And the brain hates feeling slow. So it whispers an escape plan. Go home. Go somewhere you don't have to translate yourself every second. On my 10th day, I stood in a small apartment kitchen, holding a plate I didn't want to eat from, listening to a neighbor's TV through the wall. I understood maybe one word out of 10. Not enough to follow the story. Not enough to relax. Just enough to feel excluded. That's a special kind of tired. Not physical. Emotional. Linguistic. You're not just learning English. You're learning how to exist in it. Here's something no one tells you about learning a language as an adult. It attacks your identity. Back home, you're funny. You're smart. You have opinions that flow easily. In a new language, you become quiet. Careful. Childlike. And your ego doesn't handle that well. Mine didn't. Every sentence felt like a test. Every conversation felt like a performance I was failing in slow motion. That night, I opened my laptop and searched for flights home. Not seriously. Just to look. That's how it always starts. You don't decide to quit. You just imagine relief. Familiar food. Familiar jokes. A language that doesn't fight back. Studies in behavioral psychology show that when stress is high and reward feels distant, the brain chooses certainty over growth. Going home was certainty. But then something small happened. Not inspiring. Not cinematic. I received a message from someone I barely knew, asking, how's America? I stared at the screen for a long time. I wanted to answer honestly. I wanted to say, it's hard. I feel lost. I don't sound like myself anymore. But I didn't have the English for that yet. So I typed, it's different. I'm learning. And that sentence mattered more than I realized. Because it reframed the story. I wasn't failing. I was learning. Neuroscience calls this cognitive reappraisal, changing the meaning of a situation to reduce emotional pain. I didn't need to love America yet. I didn't need to master English. I just needed to stay in the sentence I was already in. That's when I made a quiet decision. Not I will succeed. Not I will stay forever. Just this, I will not decide today. I will give myself time. Time is underrated in language learning. We chase fluency, but fluency is built on exposure, not effort. The brain absorbs patterns when it feels safe. Pressure slows it down. Patience speeds it up. So I stayed. The next morning, the sky was still cold. My English was still broken. But something shifted. I stopped trying to sound smart. I started trying to understand. I listened without panicking. I repeated phrases out loud when no one was around. Slowly. Badly. Honestly. If you're listening to this to practice English, notice something. You're not rushing. You're not translating every word. You're following a story. That's how the brain learns best, through narrative, emotion, and repetition. Research shows that stories activate more areas of the brain than isolated information. You remember feelings longer than rules. That first decision, to not go home yet, didn't solve my problems. It just kept the door open. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing you can do. Not quitting loudly. Just staying quietly. Looking back, I realized this wasn't about America. Or English. Or even courage. It was about allowing myself to be unfinished. To be a beginner again. To accept that growth feels like confusion before it feels like progress. So if you're at the edge right now, hovering over your own version of a go home button, hear this clearly. You don't have to decide today. Stay in the sentence. Let it be imperfect. Because this story, the one you're living in a language that isn't fully yours yet, hasn't reached its turning point. And neither have you. Climate shock. Have you ever felt tired for no clear reason, even when you slept enough, ate enough, and did nothing wrong? That was my second month in the United States. Not sad enough to cry. Not motivated enough to try harder. Just quietly drained. And the strange part was this, I didn't know the weather could do that to a person. I thought climate was just background noise. Turns out, it speaks fluently to your nervous system. I arrived from a place where seasons gently change, where your body already knows what tomorrow will feel like. In the U.S. Especially where I lived, weather was aggressive. Sunlight could disappear for days. Cold air didn't ask permission. It entered your bones. Mornings were gray, afternoons were gray, and by 4 p.m., your brain thought the day was already over. I didn't have the English to explain this feeling, but my body understood it perfectly. There's real science behind this. Reduced sunlight lowers serotonin levels, which affects mood, focus, and motivation. For someone learning a new language, this matters more than people admit. Language learning depends on attention, emotional regulation, and memory. When the climate messes with your internal chemistry, English suddenly feels heavier. Not harder. Heavier. Like every sentence costs energy you don't have. I noticed it during simple routines. Walking to the bus stop, my shoulders stayed tense. I avoided eye contact, not because I was shy, but because my brain was already overloaded. Cold air, unfamiliar sounds, fast English conversations around me, my senses were constantly negotiating. By the time I sat down to practice listening or reading, my mind wanted silence, not sentences. This is where many learners blame themselves. I'm lazy. I'm losing motivation. Maybe I'm not serious enough. But that's unfair. Your brain isn't failing. It's adapting. Cognitive load theory explains that when too many new variables appear at once, learning efficiency drops. Climate is one of those variables, especially when it's extreme or unfamiliar. One evening, I tried to practice English by watching a simple TV show. Nothing complex. Everyday dialogue. But my attention kept slipping. I replayed the same line 5 times. Not because it was fast, but because my brain refused to stay present. I felt frustrated, almost betrayed by myself. Back home, I could study for hours. Here, 30 minutes felt like climbing a hill in winter boots. Then something unexpected happened. I started noticing how Americans talked about the weather. Constantly. Small talk, real talk, emotional talk. It's freezing today. This winter is brutal. I miss the sun. Weather wasn't just information. It was shared experience. A social bridge. And slowly, without planning to, I started listening more carefully. I learned phrases without studying them. Stay warm. Drive safe. It's not too bad today. These sentences were short, emotional, repetitive. Perfect for the brain. Linguists call this high-frequency, low-stress input. It sticks because it's useful immediately. I didn't memorize vocabulary. I absorbed it, standing in line, waiting for coffee, complaining quietly with strangers. This shifted something important. I stopped treating English as a task and started treating it as weather itself, something you live inside, not something you conquer. On colder days, I allowed myself to learn less. On brighter days, I spoke more. This flexibility reduced resistance. Studies show that self-compassion improves learning persistence more than discipline alone. I was accidentally doing something right. The climate also changed how I sounded in English. My voice became softer. Slower. At first, I hated that. I thought confidence meant volume. Fluency meant speed. But native speakers responded better when I spoke calmly. They leaned in. They waited. Communication improved, not because my grammar was better, but because my pace matched my emotional state. There's a lesson here for anyone practicing listening and speaking. Your environment shapes your language rhythm. If you're tense, your brain rushes. If you're cold, your body tightens, affecting breath and pronunciation. When I started breathing deeper, literally because cold air forced me to, I spoke more clearly. Slower English wasn't weak English. It was stable English. One day, during a rare sunny afternoon, I realized I had gone an entire morning without translating in my head. Not perfectly, but naturally. My brain had adjusted. Not because the climate changed, but because I stopped fighting it. Adaptation isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It feels like less effort, not more success. Climate shock didn't make me want to go home immediately. It made me tired enough to doubt everything slowly. That's more dangerous. But it also taught me this: if you respect the conditions you're learning in, weather, culture, emotions, your progress becomes sustainable. So if you're learning English and feel strangely exhausted, ask yourself something honest. Is it really the language? Or is your body adjusting to a new environment, inside or outside? Sometimes, the problem isn't your ability. It's the climate you're standing in. And once you understand that, you stop blaming yourself for the cold. Culture gap. Imagine waking up one day and realizing you know the rules of the game, but not the game itself. You understand the words people are using, yet somehow you still miss the point. That was my life in the United States once the initial excitement faded and the climate shock settled in. The weather attacked my body first. Culture attacked my mind. Quietly. Politely. Constantly. In the beginning, nothing felt hostile. People said thank you, sorry, and have a nice day more times than I could count. On the surface, everything was friendly. But friendliness is not the same as closeness. And this difference matters more than you expect when you're trying to live and learn English inside a new society. Cultural psychologists talk about something called implicit rules. These are rules no one explains because everyone assumes you already know them. How close to stand when talking. How long to hold eye contact. When silence is comfortable and when it's awkward. In my home culture, silence meant respect or thoughtfulness. In many American conversations, silence felt like absence. Like something was missing and needed to be filled quickly. So people filled it. With words. Fast words. At the grocery store, the cashier asked, "How are you today?" I answered honestly. Not dramatically, just honestly. I explained I was tired, adjusting, learning. She smiled politely, nodded, and moved on. That's when I learned something important. Some questions aren't invitations. They're rituals. Linguistic rituals. And if you don't know that, you accidentally break the rhythm of the interaction. This happened everywhere. Invitations that weren't really invitations. Compliments that didn't expect a response. Apologies that didn't mean guilt. None of this was wrong. It was just different. But difference creates friction, and friction creates fatigue. From a learning perspective, this is exhausting. Your brain isn't just decoding English. It's decoding intention, tone, social meaning. Pragmatics, the study of how language is used in context, shows that misunderstandings often come not from vocabulary, but from cultural expectation. I had the words. I missed the timing. There were moments when I felt invisible. Not ignored, but unseen. People were kind, yet distant. Conversations stayed on the surface. Weather, work, schedules. Efficiency ruled everything. Back home, relationships grew through shared time. In the U.S., they grew through shared purpose. If you didn't know why you were talking, the conversation ended quickly. This affected my confidence in speaking English more than grammar ever did. I began to hesitate. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't know if it was appropriate to say it. That hesitation slowed my speech, broke my flow, and made me sound less fluent than I actually was. Here's the psychological trap. When communication feels risky, the brain chooses safety. It shortens sentences, avoids nuance, stays quiet. This is called communicative withdrawal. Many adult language learners experience it, but they think it's a language problem. It's not. It's a cultural stress response. One afternoon, I watched a group of coworkers laugh loudly over something I didn't understand. Not the joke, but the energy. It felt exaggerated. Almost fake. Then I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't pretending. They were signaling connection. In American culture, emotion is often performed outwardly. In mine, it's shared inwardly. Once I saw that, listening became easier. I stopped judging the tone and started observing the pattern. Laughter here meant, we're okay. Small talk meant, you're safe here. Efficiency meant, I respect your time. These weren't cold behaviors. They were compressed warmth. This realization changed how I practiced English. Instead of trying to sound natural, I tried to sound clear. Instead of trying to be interesting, I tried to be appropriate. And slowly, people responded differently. Conversations lasted longer. Eye contact softened. I wasn't fluent yet, but I was readable. There's solid research supporting this shift. Studies show that learners who focus on sociolinguistic competence, knowing when and how to say things, integrate faster than those who focus only on grammar accuracy. Language lives inside culture, not above it. I also stopped romanticizing my discomfort. Culture shock isn't a failure phase. It's a transition phase. It means your old map no longer works, but a new one is forming. That confusion you feel? It's learning in progress. So if you're practicing English through stories like this, notice how the pauses feel. How emotion is signaled. How meaning isn't always in the words. This kind of listening trains more than your ears. It trains your intuition. The culture gap didn't close overnight. But once I stopped fighting it, it stopped pushing back. I learned that fitting in doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means understanding the room well enough to be yourself inside it. And that understanding didn't make me louder. It made me steadier. Language fatigue. Have you ever felt tired after saying almost nothing? Not physically tired, but mentally drained, like your brain just ran a marathon while your body stayed still. That was language fatigue. And it arrived quietly, disguised as boredom, laziness, or a sudden dislike for English. But it wasn't any of those things. It was my brain asking for mercy. Language fatigue doesn't feel dramatic. There's no explosion, no breakdown. It feels like resistance. You open a video to practice listening, and your finger suddenly wants to scroll. You promise yourself just 10 minutes, but even that feels heavy. You're not confused. You're exhausted. And the worst part? You don't feel like you've earned the exhaustion. Every day in the U.S., English surrounded me. On signs. On screens. In voices behind me at the bus stop. My brain never fully rested. Even when I wasn't studying, I was decoding. Psychologists call this continuous partial attention. Your mind is always half working, always alert, never fully off. Over time, that burns energy fast. At first, I thought immersion was supposed to make learning easier. And it does, eventually. But before that, it overloads you. Think of your brain like a phone battery. Immersion is not a charger. It's multiple apps running at once. Language, culture, emotion, survival. No wonder the battery drains. I remember sitting at my desk, opening a simple listening exercise. Slow English. Clear voice. Perfect for learning. And yet my chest felt tight. I replayed the first sentence 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I didn't want to continue. That's when guilt arrived. You should be grateful. Others would love this opportunity. Guilt makes fatigue worse. It turns rest into failure. Neuroscience explains this better than motivation ever could. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for attention and decision-making, gets tired faster when operating in a non-native language. Each sentence requires more effort, more monitoring, more self-correction. Over time, this creates cognitive exhaustion. Not weakness. Biology. Here's the mistake I made. I tried to push through it. More listening. More repetition. Longer sessions. I treated fatigue like a discipline problem. That backfired. My comprehension dropped. My pronunciation stiffened. I started associating English with pressure. And once the brain links learning to stress, it resists harder. One evening, something broke the pattern. I was too tired to study, so I didn't. Instead, I cooked dinner and played a podcast quietly in the background. No subtitles. No intention to understand. Just sound. English without responsibility. And something strange happened. I caught phrases. Not all of them. But enough. My brain relaxed, and comprehension slipped in sideways. This aligns with research on passive input. When the brain isn't under performance pressure, it processes language more naturally. This is why children learn faster. Not because they're smarter, but because they're not trying to be correct. They're just present. The next day, I changed my approach. I shortened my sessions. I spoke out loud only when I felt calm. I repeated simple phrases like "It's okay, take your time, I'm learning." Not as vocabulary practice, but as emotional regulation. Language isn't just communication. It's self-talk. I also stopped forcing output. Many learners think speaking more always helps. But during fatigue, forced speaking can deepen frustration. So I listened more. Slowly. I let my mouth rest while my ears worked. This restored balance. Studies show that comprehension recovers faster than production during burnout phases. Listening is gentler. It heals. There were days I didn't practice at all. And instead of falling behind, I moved forward. Because rest consolidated memory. Sleep strengthened neural connections. My brain organized what it had already absorbed. Progress isn't always visible. Sometimes it feels like nothing is happening. But inside, patterns are settling. One morning, without planning to, I answered a question in English smoothly. No pause. No translation. Just response. That moment didn't come from effort. It came from recovery. Language fatigue had lifted slightly, and fluency peeked through the gap. So if you're listening to this and feeling tired of English, hear this clearly. You are not broken. You are not unmotivated. You are human. Learning a language through life is intense. It demands patience not just with words, but with yourself. Try this instead of pushing harder. Slow down the input. Lower the volume of expectation. Let English exist around you without testing you. Speak when your body feels safe. Listen when your mind feels open. Rest when everything feels heavy. Language fatigue doesn't mean you should quit. It means you've been trying. And trying, for a long time, in a language that still isn't yours. The goal isn't to survive English. It's to make peace with it. Policy reality. Imagine trying to explain who you are while filling out a form that doesn't have a box for it. That's what policies felt like in the United States, not cruel, not personal, just indifferent. Rules written in perfect English, applied without emotion, asking questions your life didn't know how to answer yet. I thought language was my biggest challenge. Then paperwork taught me humility. At first, policies looked simple. Dates. Numbers. Signatures. But simplicity on paper doesn't mean simplicity in life. Every document assumed context I didn't have. Every instruction assumed cultural knowledge I hadn't learned. And every mistake came with consequences, not lessons. This wasn't like a classroom. This was real English, attached to real outcomes. I remember reading the same paragraph over and over, knowing every word but missing the meaning. That's a specific kind of frustration. Linguists call it semantic overload, when language is technically clear but practically confusing. The sentence is correct. Your understanding isn't. And because policies don't slow down or rephrase, the pressure builds quietly. This affected my English learning in a way I didn't expect. Suddenly, English wasn't just communication. It was authority, control, access. If I misunderstood, I didn't just feel embarrassed. I felt unsafe. Psychological studies show that when language is linked to threat, the brain shifts into survival mode. Learning shuts down. Compliance takes over. I became cautious. Overly cautious. I double-checked everything. I avoided speaking unless necessary. My sentences got shorter, flatter. Not because my English worsened, but because risk tolerance dropped. When mistakes cost time, money, or status, you don't experiment. And experimentation is how fluency grows. One day, standing in line at an office, I watched people move efficiently. They knew the system. They knew what to say, when to say it, and how loud. Their English wasn't just fluent. It was procedural. Mine was emotional. That gap mattered. What surprised me most was how little empathy the system required. Not because people were unkind, but because the system wasn't designed for explanation. Policies assume you'll adapt. Quickly. Without complaint. This is common in high-functioning bureaucracies. Efficiency is valued over comfort. For someone learning the language, that efficiency feels like coldness. And yet, there was another side. Once you understand the rules, life becomes predictable. Predictability reduces anxiety. Anxiety blocks learning. Slowly, I saw the logic. Policies weren't against me. They just weren't aware of me. That distinction matters. It removes personal offense from the experience. I started changing how I interacted with English in these situations. I stopped trying to understand everything emotionally and focused on function. What is this document asking me to do? What action follows this sentence? This is called task-based language processing. It reduces cognitive load by narrowing focus. Instead of translating meaning, you execute steps. I also learned the power of asking simple questions. Not perfect questions. Clear ones. Can you repeat that? What is the next step? Is this correct? These sentences became survival tools. Short. Polite. Effective. Research shows that functional phrases are retained faster because they produce immediate results. Confidence followed usefulness. There were still moments of frustration. Moments when English felt like a wall instead of a bridge. But I noticed something important. Each policy I navigated successfully left a trace of confidence. Not pride. Stability. The kind that doesn't need applause. This changed my relationship with learning English. I stopped chasing fluency as a goal and started valuing reliability. Could I understand instructions? Could I respond appropriately? Could I correct mistakes without panic? These skills mattered more than sounding natural. And ironically, they made my English better. For learners listening to this, here's the quiet lesson. Language tied to responsibility feels heavier. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means your brain is prioritizing safety. Work with that, not against it. Practice English in low-risk spaces so you have energy for high-risk ones. Policies taught me patience. They forced me to slow down, read carefully, and accept that confusion wasn't failure. It was part of the process. And over time, the fear softened. English stopped feeling like a judge and started feeling like a tool. I didn't love the system. I still don't. But I learned to move inside it. And that movement mattered. Because once you stop feeling trapped by language, you start using it instead of surviving it. Policy reality didn't push me home. It taught me how to stand my ground. Lonely love. Have you ever felt lonely even while talking to someone every day? Not the dramatic loneliness where you cry at night, but the quiet one that sits beside you, nodding, pretending to listen. That was the season when love entered my life in the United States. Not as a rescue. Not as a miracle. But as a mirror. And mirrors can be uncomfortable when you're still figuring out who you are in a new language. I didn't meet love when I felt confident. I met it when my English was clumsy, my routines unstable, and my sense of belonging unfinished. We talked slowly at first. Not because we wanted to be romantic, but because slowness was necessary. I searched for words. They waited. Sometimes too patiently. Silence filled the gaps, and I learned quickly that silence feels different when someone is choosing to stay inside it with you. Psychologists say loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of being understood. And learning English in a foreign country amplifies that gap. You're expressing thoughts through a filter, hoping the meaning survives the translation. Early conversations felt fragile. I wasn't sure if I was being clear or just being tolerated. There were misunderstandings. Small ones. Then bigger ones. Tone issues. Cultural assumptions. Jokes that didn't land. Feelings that sounded harsher in English than they felt in my heart. I realized something important. Language doesn't just carry meaning. It carries emotion. And when your emotional vocabulary is limited, your feelings get compressed. This created a strange dynamic. I listened more than I spoke. I nodded often. I agreed quickly. Not because I lacked opinions, but because disagreement felt risky. Studies in intercultural relationships show that non-native speakers often suppress emotional complexity to avoid conflict. I was doing that without knowing it. Love became quieter, simpler, safer, but also lonelier. There were moments I questioned whether love could survive this imbalance. Could someone truly know me if I couldn't fully explain myself? Could affection grow when one person is constantly translating their soul? These questions didn't come with answers. They came with tension. One night, after a misunderstanding that wasn't anyone's fault, I found myself unable to explain why I felt hurt. The words existed somewhere in my native language, but not in English. My chest felt tight. My thoughts scattered. And then something unexpected happened. I said, slowly, I don't have the English for this feeling yet. That sentence changed everything. It was honest. It was simple. And it invited patience instead of conflict. Emotional psychologists emphasize the power of meta-communication, talking about communication itself. By naming the limitation, I reduced its power. Love didn't need perfect English. It needed transparency. From that point on, we learned together. Not grammar. Presence. We spoke slower. We asked more questions. We clarified intentions instead of assuming them. I learned phrases that mattered more than vocabulary lists. That's not what I meant. I need time to think. Please be patient with me. These sentences weren't romantic, but they were intimate. Lonely Love taught me something else about language learning. Motivation doesn't always come from ambition. Sometimes it comes from connection. I wanted to explain myself better. Not to impress, but to be seen. This kind of motivation is intrinsic. It lasts longer. Neuroscience shows that emotionally meaningful goals activate deeper learning pathways. My English improved not because I studied harder, but because I cared differently. There were still lonely moments. Moments when cultural expectations around dating, independence, and emotional expression clashed. In American culture, emotional clarity is often valued. Directness is seen as honesty. In mine, nuance matters more. I had to learn how to be direct without feeling rude, open without feeling exposed. This balancing act sharpened my emotional intelligence as much as my language skills. I also learned to listen beyond words. Body language. Timing. Energy shifts. These became part of my comprehension. Language learning isn't only auditory. It's relational. When you pay attention to how people respond, not just what they say, your understanding deepens. Lonely Love didn't fix my loneliness. It revealed it. And then it softened it. It showed me that connection isn't about fluency. It's about effort, patience, and the willingness to sit inside discomfort together. If you're learning English and feel emotionally distant from people around you, know this. It's not because you're incapable of love or connection. It's because intimacy takes language, and language takes time. Don't rush either. Love in a second language is slower. Messier. But also more intentional. Every word chosen matters. Every pause carries weight. And in that slowness, something honest grows. Lonely Love didn't make me feel complete. It made me feel real. Marriage test. Imagine trying to build a bridge while still learning the names of the tools. That's what marriage felt like for me in the United States. Not a fairy tale test, not a dramatic battle, but a long, quiet exam where every question was written in a language I was still decoding. Love was there. Commitment was there. But marriage added pressure, structure, permanence. And suddenly, English wasn't just for conversation. It was for conflict, responsibility, and repair. Before marriage, misunderstandings could be postponed, laughed off, explained later. After marriage, they demanded attention. Bills, schedules, decisions about the future. These things don't wait for fluency. They arrive on time, whether your English is ready or not. And when stakes rise, language gaps feel wider. One of the first shocks was how differently conflict worked. In my culture, disagreement often hides behind tone, silence, or indirect signals. In American culture, clarity is respect. Say what you mean. Say it early. Say it clearly. This sounds healthy in theory. In practice, it terrified me. Because clarity requires vocabulary. And emotional vocabulary is the hardest kind to learn. Psychologists note that couples argue not because of problems, but because of unmet expectations. In intercultural marriages, expectations are often invisible. You don't know what you're supposed to expect, let alone explain why you're disappointed. So tension builds quietly. And quiet tension is dangerous because it looks like calm. I remember an argument that wasn't really an argument. Just a discussion that went too fast. Words came at me, reasonable and calm, but my processing lagged behind. By the time I understood the point, the moment had passed. I nodded. Agreed. Inside, I felt small. Not angry. Unheard. This created a pattern. I became the one who needed time. Time to think. Time to translate. Time to respond. Time, however, can feel like avoidance to someone who values immediate clarity. So we were both right, and both frustrated. Here's where marriage became a language lesson no textbook offers. I learned that communication isn't about speed. It's about synchronization. Two people don't need the same language level. They need the same rhythm. Once we saw that, things shifted. We started setting rules that weren't romantic, but necessary. Slow conversations. No important discussions when tired. Permission to pause. Permission to return later. These weren't signs of weakness. They were tools. Research in relationship psychology supports this approach. Couples who regulate emotional timing communicate more effectively than those who prioritize immediacy. My English didn't magically improve. But my ability to use it under pressure did. I practiced sentences meant for repair, not performance. I need help understanding. That's not what I intended. Can we talk about this later? These phrases saved more arguments than advanced vocabulary ever could. Marriage also forced me to confront my fear of sounding wrong. In learning English, many adults avoid speaking to avoid mistakes. In marriage, silence becomes a mistake of its own. So I spoke, even when it felt risky. I learned that imperfect honesty builds more trust than perfect silence. There was another challenge no one warned me about, emotional equality. When one partner operates effortlessly in the dominant language, power imbalances can form unintentionally. Not because one wants control, but because expression equals influence. I had to learn how to reclaim my voice without resentment. That meant asking for space, not demanding it. Explaining my limits, not apologizing for them. Over time, something unexpected happened. English stopped being the enemy during conflict. It became the medium. We built shared meanings. Inside jokes. Familiar phrases. Language became ours, not just mine or theirs. Linguists call this co-constructed language, meaning created together through repeated interaction. It's intimate. It's personal. And it doesn't exist in dictionaries. Marriage also deepened my listening skills. Not just listening for words, but for intent. Stress. Fatigue. Care hidden behind irritation. This kind of listening improved my English faster than drills ever did. Because understanding people requires more than grammar. It requires presence. There were still hard days. Days when I missed the ease of my native language. Days when explaining feelings felt like lifting weight with numb hands. But marriage taught me endurance. Not the dramatic kind. The daily kind. Showing up. Trying again. Clarifying once more. If you're learning English and worried about relationships, hear this. Fluency is not a prerequisite for commitment. Willingness is. Marriage doesn't demand perfect language. It demands effort, patience, and the courage to stay in the conversation even when it's uncomfortable. This stage of my life didn't make English easier. It made it necessary. And necessity, over time, turns fear into function. Family moments. Have you ever noticed how a room sounds different when children are inside it? Even when they're quiet, the air changes. That was the moment family truly entered my life in the United States, not through paperwork or promises, but through sound. Small footsteps. Half-finished sentences. Questions that didn't care about my accent or grammar. Family didn't wait for my English to be ready. It arrived anyway. Before that, English had always felt like a test. A system measuring how well I fit. With family, English became something else. It became background music. Imperfect, repetitive, forgiving. And that changed everything. When children came into my life, language slowed down naturally. They didn't rush. They repeated themselves. They used simple structures, clear emotions, and obvious intentions. Linguists say child-directed speech is one of the most effective learning environments for language acquisition. I didn't plan to use it. I lived inside it. Why is a powerful word. Children use it endlessly, without shame. Answering it forced me to simplify my English. Not to sound correct, but to sound clear. And clarity is the foundation of fluency. When you explain the world to a child, you stop hiding behind complex sentences. You choose meaning over elegance. Family life also introduced routine. Breakfast. school runs, bedtime stories. Routine matters because the brain loves predictability. In predictable environments, cognitive resources free up for learning. English stopped being something I had to schedule. It was woven into the day. Softly. Repeatedly. There were moments of frustration. Moments when I couldn't find the right word quickly enough. When emotions ran ahead of language. But children don't wait for perfect explanations. They read tone. They feel intention. That taught me an important lesson. Communication isn't just verbal. It's relational. Psychologists studying bilingual households note that emotional bonds form regardless of language accuracy. Connection doesn't require fluency. Presence does. Once I understood that, pressure eased. My English improved not because I studied harder, but because I spoke without fear of being judged. Family also reshaped my listening skills. I learned to listen for needs instead of words. Hunger. Fatigue. Curiosity. These cues trained my attention. Listening became active, embodied. Not just sound processing, but awareness. This kind of listening transfers directly to language learning. You stop chasing every word and start following meaning. One evening, during a simple family dinner, I realized I had spoken English for hours without thinking about it. Not perfectly. Not confidently. But continuously. That continuity mattered more than correctness. Research in applied linguistics shows that sustained low-pressure output accelerates fluency more effectively than short, high-pressure practice. Family life created exactly that environment. There was also something humbling about learning English alongside children. They corrected me without cruelty. They asked questions without embarrassment. They celebrated small wins without comparison. Watching them learn reminded me how unnatural adult shame is in language learning. Children don't feel stupid for not knowing. They feel curious. Family moments also brought cultural blending into daily life. Holidays. Food. Traditions. I had to explain my culture in English while learning theirs. This two-way exchange deepened my vocabulary in ways textbooks never could. Words attached to memory stick longer. Especially emotional memory. At the same time, family exposed my limits. Legal terms. School policies. Medical conversations. These moments brought back anxiety. But this time, I wasn't alone. Support reduced fear. Fear reduction improved comprehension. It's a cycle most learners don't get to experience in isolation. Family didn't erase loneliness. But it redistributed it. Loneliness no longer sat only inside me. It became something shared, navigated, softened. And English became the tool we used to move through it together. For learners watching this, especially those practicing listening and speaking through stories, understand this. Language grows faster when it's attached to life. Not ambition. Not comparison. Life. Family accelerates that growth because it removes performance from the equation. You're not trying to impress. You're trying to connect. Family moments taught me patience. With myself. With English. With progress. They showed me that language isn't mastered in dramatic breakthroughs, but in quiet repetitions. In bedtime phrases. In shared laughter. In mistakes that don't matter. By the time I noticed my English improving, it had already happened. That's how natural acquisition feels. Invisible until it's undeniable. Family didn't make my English perfect. It made it alive. Learning shift. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop trying so hard, things begin to work? Not magically, not instantly, but quietly, like a knot loosening on its own. That was the shift. Not in my English level, but in my relationship with learning itself. Up until then, English had been something I chased. After that point, it became something I lived inside. The shift didn't come from a book or a method. It came from exhaustion. I was tired of measuring progress. Tired of asking, am I better yet? Tired of turning every conversation into a performance review. So without announcing it, I changed the rules. I stopped studying English as a subject and started treating it as a place. This matters more than it sounds. Cognitive science shows that the brain learns differently when information is contextual rather than abstract. When English lived inside my daily story, family, weather, routines, it stopped floating. It anchored. Words attached themselves to moments, not lists. I began telling my own story in English. Not writing it. Saying it. Out loud. Slowly. Repeating the same memories, the same feelings, the same events. At first, it felt boring. Why say the same thing again? But repetition is how the brain builds automaticity. Each retelling required less effort. Less translation. Less fear. Instead of practicing random dialogues, I practiced my life. This morning, I woke up early. The weather was cold. I felt tired, but calm. These sentences were simple, almost childish. But they were mine. Ownership changed everything. Studies in language acquisition show that self-referential content is remembered more easily than neutral material. My brain cared because the story was about me. Another shift happened in how I listened. I stopped trying to understand everything. I listened for the thread. The emotion. The intention. When you let go of total comprehension, anxiety drops. And when anxiety drops, comprehension improves. It's a paradox, but it's real. I also slowed my speaking on purpose. Not to sound careful, but to sound honest. Speed had become a mask. Slowness became clarity. Native speakers adjusted naturally. They mirrored my pace. Conversations softened. Communication improved. Fluency isn't about speed. It's about flow. And flow requires comfort. This shift aligned with something called embodied learning. Language isn't only processed in the brain. It's processed through breath, posture, and emotion. When I spoke slower, my breathing deepened. When my breathing deepened, my voice steadied. When my voice steadied, my confidence followed. No motivation speech required. I stopped correcting myself mid-sentence. That was huge. Self-interruption kills fluency. It trains the brain to associate speaking with error detection. Instead, I finished my thoughts, even if imperfect. Correction came later, or not at all. Interestingly, accuracy improved anyway. Because meaning had space to form. I also changed how I practiced listening. No more intense concentration for long periods. I listened while walking, while cooking, while resting. Low-pressure exposure. This kind of distributed input strengthens neural pathways over time. It's how music becomes familiar without effort. English started to sound familiar, not threatening. The biggest mental shift was this: I stopped asking when I would be fluent. That question creates impatience. Impatience creates tension. Tension blocks learning. Instead, I asked, can I stay present today? Presence turned practice into living. There were days when progress felt invisible. Days when I spoke worse than the day before. But regression is part of integration. The brain reorganizes before it stabilizes. This is well documented in learning theory. Temporary confusion often precedes long-term improvement. Knowing that kept me calm. Learning through my own story also deepened my emotional vocabulary. I didn't learn words like resilient or fulfilled from lists. I learned them because I needed them. Need is the strongest teacher. When language solves a real problem, it sticks. For anyone using this video to practice listening and speaking, notice what's happening now. You're following a story, not a lesson. You're understanding without translating every word. That's the shift in action. This is how real English enters the body. Gently. Repeatedly. Naturally. The shift didn't make me confident overnight. But it made me consistent. And consistency beats intensity every time. Language grows through exposure, not pressure. Through patience, not punishment. Looking back, this was the moment English stopped being something outside of me. It became part of how I think, how I remember, how I explain my life to myself. I didn't learn English faster. I learned it deeper. Small English wins. Have you ever underestimated a small win because it didn't look impressive from the outside? Not a promotion. Not a certificate. Just a moment where something worked without effort. That's where my English began to change for real. Not in classrooms or tests, but in quiet victories no one clapped for. And those wins mattered more than anything loud. The first one was simple. Someone asked me a question, and I answered without rehearsing in my head. No translation. No panic. Just response. It wasn't perfect. But it was immediate. That immediacy felt like oxygen. Psychologists call this automaticity, the stage where a skill stops demanding conscious control. It's fragile at first, like thin ice, but once you step on it and don't fall, trust begins to grow. Another small win happened at a store. The cashier made a joke. I smiled and replied on time. Not late. Not after thinking. On time. Humor is difficult because it depends on timing, not vocabulary. That moment told me my listening had crossed an invisible line. My brain wasn't decoding anymore. It was participating. These moments didn't arrive because I studied harder. They arrived because pressure had decreased. Language learning research consistently shows that positive emotional feedback strengthens neural pathways more effectively than correction. Small wins reward the brain. Reward encourages repetition. Repetition builds skill. It's a loop, not a ladder. I started collecting these wins quietly. Not writing them down. Feeling them. A phone call handled calmly. An email written without rewriting 10 times. A conversation where I asked a follow-up question instead of ending it early. Each one added a layer of stability. Confidence stopped being an idea and became a sensation. There's an important psychological shift here. When learners focus only on gaps, what they can't do, they stay tense. Tension narrows attention. Narrow attention misses progress. By noticing small wins, attention widens. You start seeing growth everywhere. This isn't positive thinking. It's perceptual training. I also noticed my mistakes changing shape. Early mistakes were basic. Wrong tense. Wrong word. Later mistakes were subtle. Tone. Nuance. Cultural timing. That's progress. Errors moving up the ladder means you're climbing it. Linguists call this developmental error progression. You don't make fewer mistakes. You make better ones. Small wins also changed how others treated me. People waited less. Interrupted less. Listened more. Not because my English was flawless, but because my delivery felt grounded. Communication is as much about confidence cues as language accuracy. Eye contact. Pace. Breath. These improved naturally as anxiety dropped. One unexpected win came from teaching someone else. Explaining a simple concept in English forced clarity. Teaching reveals what you truly understand. And when I could explain without notes, I knew something had settled. Knowledge had become accessible. I also learned to celebrate restraint. Knowing when not to speak. Knowing when listening was enough. That's a win too. Many learners think fluency means constant output. It doesn't. It means appropriate output. Knowing when silence supports communication is advanced skill, not weakness. These small wins accumulated quietly until one day I realized something surprising. I wasn't thinking about English anymore. Not because I mastered it, but because it stopped being the center of attention. Life took that place back. Language became the medium, not the mission. This is crucial for anyone practicing through stories. You don't improve by hunting big breakthroughs. You improve by allowing small successes to repeat. The brain builds habits from consistency, not intensity. 10 small wins beat one dramatic moment. There were still hard days. Days when English felt distant again. But small wins gave me evidence. Proof that progress wasn't imaginary. Evidence calms the nervous system. Calm improves performance. The cycle continued. I stopped asking, am I good enough yet? I started asking, what worked today? That question is gentler. And gentleness keeps you going. Behavioral science shows that sustainable habits form when effort feels manageable. Small wins make effort feel light. If you're listening to this and practicing, notice your own small wins. Understanding a sentence without translating. Recognizing a phrase you've heard before. Feeling less tired after listening. These are signals. Your brain is adapting. Quietly. Successfully. Don't wait for applause. Language growth rarely announces itself. It whispers. And if you learn to listen to those whispers, you'll realize you've been moving forward longer than you thought. Small English wins didn't make me fluent overnight. They made fluency inevitable. Why I stayed. Have you ever reached the point where leaving feels easier than staying, but staying feels more honest? That's the moment people rarely talk about. Not the dramatic crossroads. The quiet one. When nothing is broken enough to escape, yet nothing is comfortable enough to relax. That was the moment I finally understood why I stayed in the United States. And no, it wasn't because things suddenly got easy. Up until then, staying had felt like endurance. Like holding my breath for a future version of myself who would feel ready. Ready in English. Ready in culture. Ready in confidence. But that future version never arrived on schedule. What arrived instead was familiarity. Not comfort. Familiarity. And that changed the question entirely. I noticed it in small details. I understood the rhythm of days. I knew which silence meant thinking and which meant discomfort. I knew how long to wait before speaking, how to soften a sentence, how to ask without apologizing too much. These weren't skills I consciously trained. They grew quietly, through exposure. Through staying. Psychologically, this is called habituation. The brain stops flagging stimuli as threats once they become predictable. When English stopped feeling like danger, it stopped demanding all my energy. That freed space. And in that space, life expanded. I realized something uncomfortable but important. Going home wouldn't mean failure. It would mean relief. And relief is seductive. The brain loves relief. But relief doesn't always equal growth. Growth often feels like mild, ongoing discomfort. Not pain. Just stretch. I stayed because English stopped being the reason I woke up anxious. It became the way I navigated the day. I stayed because conversations no longer drained me completely. I stayed because misunderstandings didn't feel personal anymore. They felt solvable. Another reason was love, but not the romantic kind alone. It was attachment. To routines. To people who knew my pauses. to places where my accent was familiar. Belonging didn't arrive as a feeling. It arrived as absence of fear. And that's when I knew something had changed. Sociologists say belonging isn't about acceptance. It's about participation. When you can contribute without constantly proving yourself, you belong. I wasn't fluent. But I was functional. I could help. I could explain. I could show up. That mattered more than sounding native. I also stayed because my relationship with English matured. Early on, English was a judge. Later, a tool. Eventually, a companion. Not perfect. Sometimes annoying. But present. We had history together. You don't abandon something you've built a history with so easily. There was a moment when someone asked me, "Do you feel American now?" I didn't know how to answer. Identity doesn't switch languages overnight. But I knew this. I no longer felt like a visitor. Visitors count days. I counted seasons. Staying also meant accepting that comfort would always be partial. That's a hard truth. Every country has friction. Every language has limits. Staying wasn't about finding the perfect place. It was about choosing which difficulties I was willing to live with. English difficulty had become manageable. Starting over somewhere else felt heavier. From a learning perspective, this decision mattered. Long-term exposure is what turns input into intuition. You can't rush that. You can't fake it. You have to stay long enough for patterns to sink below consciousness. That's when language becomes natural. For those practicing listening and speaking now, understand this. The decision to stay with English, mentally, emotionally, comes before fluency. You don't wait until you're good to commit. You commit so you can become good. I stayed because leaving would have meant letting fear make the final decision. And fear had already spoken enough. Staying didn't silence fear completely. But it reduced its authority. Looking back, the question "Why did you stay?" has a simple answer and a complex one. The simple answer is, because I could. The complex answer is, because staying allowed me to finish becoming someone I had already started. I almost went home. But I stayed long enough for English to stop being the reason. It became the road. A gentle ending. Have you ever looked back at a version of yourself and realized you don't feel embarrassed anymore, only grateful? That's how this story ends. Not with fireworks. Not with perfect English. But with a quiet sense of arrival. The kind you don't notice at first because it doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, steady, waiting for you to catch up. By the time I realized the story was ending, nothing dramatic had changed. I still had an accent. I still paused sometimes to find the right word. I still misunderstood jokes and policies and moods once in a while. But something fundamental was different. I wasn't fighting English anymore. I was living with it. This matters because many people believe a happy ending means completion. Fluency achieved. Confidence unlocked. Struggle erased. Real life doesn't work that way. A good ending doesn't remove difficulty. It reframes it. Difficulty stops being a threat and becomes part of the landscape. Psychologically, this is called integration. The moment when a challenge becomes incorporated into identity instead of standing outside it. English didn't feel like an exam I was constantly failing. It felt like a tool I used, sometimes clumsily, sometimes well, but always mine. I noticed it in how I spoke to myself. Earlier, my inner voice was harsh. You should know this by now. That sounded stupid. Why is this still hard? Later, that voice softened. It's okay. You're learning. You handled that better than before. Self-talk shapes behavior. Neuroscience shows that supportive inner dialogue improves cognitive flexibility. And flexibility is what language learning thrives on. The ending was also shaped by family. Not as a solution, but as context. Family doesn't erase struggle. It gives it meaning. English became the language of daily care. Appointments. School notes. Bedtime conversations. These moments weren't impressive, but they were real. Language embedded in responsibility sticks deeper than language practiced in isolation. There was love too. Not the lonely kind anymore. The grounded kind. Love that doesn't rush explanations. Love that understands pauses. Love that accepts that some feelings arrive before words do. That kind of love doesn't require fluency. It requires presence. And presence is learnable. Culturally, I stopped measuring myself against an invisible standard. I wasn't trying to sound American. I was trying to be understood. Those are different goals. One creates anxiety. The other creates connection. When I chose the second, communication improved naturally. From a learning perspective, the ending makes sense. Long-term exposure. Emotional relevance. Low-pressure repetition. These are the conditions under which language stabilizes. Not hacks. Not shortcuts. Just life, lived long enough in one place. I also learned to respect the seasons of learning. There were intense periods. There were quiet ones. Growth didn't follow a straight line. It curved. Sometimes backward. Sometimes sideways. That's normal. Skill acquisition research confirms that plateaus and regressions are signs of consolidation, not failure. If you're listening to this as English practice, notice how it feels now compared to the beginning. You're still listening. You're still following. Your brain isn't panicking. That's progress. Not dramatic. But real. And real progress lasts. The happy ending isn't that I mastered English. It's that English stopped standing between me and my life. It became part of how I loved, worked, argued, rested, and dreamed. Not perfect. But present. I didn't stay because everything worked out perfectly. I stayed because staying allowed things to work out imperfectly, over time. That's the kind of ending most lives have. And it's enough. So if you're somewhere in the middle of your own story, tired, unsure, tempted to quit, remember this. You don't need a big reason to stay. Sometimes, the quiet ones are stronger. Familiarity. Connection. Small wins that add up. A life that slowly opens instead of closing. This story ends gently because that's how real change feels. Not like a victory shout. Like a deep breath you didn't realize you were holding. You almost went home. But you stayed long enough to belong. If you're still listening right now, it means this story touched something real inside you. Not because the English was perfect, but because the feeling was familiar. This wasn't just a story about moving to America. It was a story about learning English through real life, through fear, silence, love, and small daily victories. And this is only one chapter. In the next videos, I'll share more slow English listening stories, real conversations, and life moments that help you understand English naturally. Without pressure, without rushing, and without feeling not good enough. So if you want to, improve your English listening skills. Learn spoken English naturally. Feel confident with real-life English. And grow step by step. At your own pace. Subscribe to this channel now and stay with me. Because the best way to learn English is to stay long enough for it to become part of your life. See you in the next story.